AJ and the folks from ASU, this is Amanda Stengus from Starling. Just let me know when you guys know best based on who's on the line. Just kind of let me know when you want to get started.
Okay, I think we can get going right now, Amanda.
Okay. Well, I guess before I jump in, are there any announcements or anything from the Advancement Center that the folks from ASU want to make sure we talk about before we jump in?
Nothing on our side other than I just want to formally introduce myself to everyone. I'm AJ. I'm taking over for Niraj over here. I've probably sent a lot of you guys some emails, so just from our end, I just wanted to introduce myself, and that's about it. And Amanda, you can take it away.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. I know it's, I was thinking the other day how dedicated you guys are to be taking this on in the summer. I know if my summer is any indication of how busy all of you folks are, we really appreciate it. We had a great time during the last session. There was a lot of really good conversation, and we're really hoping that we can continue that discussion into today's session. Today we're going to be talking about the different types of governance structures that a lot of safety net organizations evaluate when they're looking at opportunities to work together in new ways. And this, along with the session next week, really focuses a lot on sort of formal organizational structures. And we realize that not everybody may have evolved in their thinking to the point where they're going to have those distinct formal entities, but we think it's still helpful to really tee up and have these discussions, primarily for those of you who are really looking at working together with other providers in more structured ways around payment and reimbursement, and the sharing of shared services. So today, like I said, we're going to be talking about really governance models, and then we're also going to spend a little bit of time in today's session talking about the group project that you guys will all be working on over the next 5 or 6 weeks or so. I'm sure you guys remember from some orientation discussion that this virtual learning collaborative really culminates in a presentation from all of you at the end of the session. So Andrew Principe is on the line also from Starling, and he and I will be talking through that as well. So I wanted to just do a quick recap from last week. Of the folks we had on the line, 6 of you filled out the evaluations and responded to the questions, and 4 out of you are considering joining a clinical or financial network. And there were a lot of different reasons for that. Some of you were really looking to respond to some of the challenges and requests that you're getting from payers. A lot of folks are looking at establishing economies of scale and consolidating some services. And then other folks were really looking at opportunities to expand quality and access initiatives. And we know that there's a lot that we can learn from each other when we work together in those areas, and so we thought that was great. And one respondent said they weren't exactly clear what their network was going to focus on, but really anticipates that there is going to be value in working with other hospitals and providers in their area. So, thanks for that. So before we jump into today's discussion, was there any questions, anything that you thought of as you had a little bit of time to reflect on the last session? Anything that from the group? Okay. So today we're going to talk about a number of things. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about the various legal structures that are used as organizations are coming together looking to form new network structures. We're going to talk about some best practices for creating effective governance models, and really some advice and learnings from the field about, what some of your peers have experienced as they've endeavored into these new arrangements and network constructs with other providers. We're going to talk about some of the structural pieces of what goes into these new networks, and we're going to talk about kind of the difference between what an operating agreement is, what a participation agreement is, and how service contracts may come into play, because each of them has a distinct purpose, and they help really define and clarify the roles and expectations and responsibilities of the groups that are participating in your network. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're going to do a quick walkthrough of the overview of the team project assignment. Okay, so we're going to start with a discussion on legal structures. And, we get this question a lot, and I think one of the things that we appreciate and have appreciated about working with the safety net for so long is that safety net providers by far are excellent collaborators. I always tell folks it's because we've had to be scrappy over the years, because our funding and reimbursement models have really forced us into creative partnerships and creative problem solving as we've been working in fairly resource-restricted environments. So we're really good at collaborating. We see a lot of value in it, and we have been able to really demonstrate that value really to the benefit of our patients and the communities that we're serving. But why, when we start to talk about these new arrangements, are formal legal entities so important? Well, the first is that they really help to formalize the roles and responsibilities of all the participating organizations and practices. It's really important, and we're going to talk about this as we really spend the next couple of weeks with you guys thinking through the environment that you're working in, that role clarification and expectations are really clear. Typically, when we're coming together in formal structures, we're working together in ways that we've never worked together before, and oftentimes there are many things on the line and at stake that really require us to make sure that we're adhering to what the agreements are. And formal structures are a way to do that. As we talked about, I think way back in sessions one, we talked about how different network structures may play a role in creating vehicles for us to really interact differently with payers and other types of contractual relationships. And there are a lot of legal reasons why you need to have separate formal entities. Probably the most critical is, really to protect the participating organizations from any kind of financial risk. So it is really critical that we have appropriate structures that allow us to do that in a legal way and really preserve our nonprofit status as we're working together. Okay, so now this is a part of the conversation where Andy and I always like to remind folks that we are not attorneys, and that when you get to the point that you're really looking at developing models of new legal structures, there are a lot of issues that you need to take into consideration. Some of those have to do with your nonprofit status. Some of those have to do with particular requirements in your state. But regardless, we're always going to encourage that when you get to the point of really formally exploring these options, that you'll want to engage with qualified legal counsel on this. That said, we have a lot of experience in working with groups and with counsel, and I think we can provide some guidance for you guys on the types of vehicles that we see a lot. Let me start out with the limited liability corporations. These are typically the most common vehicle that we see for organizations that are coming together in some of these new constructs. The biggest value really is that in most circumstances, members of those LLCs are not going to be personally liable for any debts or liabilities that the LLC may incur. So essentially what that means is an individual practice can become an owner or a member of the LLC and not put their organization's financial liabilities on the line. So the liability stays within that new entity, and it gives the member owners a lot of protection in that way. The other value of an LLC is that there's a lot of flexibility for businesses to grow over time. That it's probably one of the most flexible models in terms of being able to provide in order to provide, a real growth opportunity for new organizational structures. Now, LLCs can be what we call wholly owned, which means they have a single member LLC, or they can be multi-member LLCs. And we really do see both when we're talking about the work that all of us are sharing and discussing over the course of this collaborative. If you are a single member LLC, you might still have a board of several organizations that are participating in the organization itself. So still lots of opportunity for providing input and being part of the overall governance structure, but it just has, whether you're single or multi-member, has to do with how many owners there are of the firm. We also see, and this is predominantly more likely in a hospital environment, a medical or a hospital foundation. Despite its name, it does not have a charitable function and instead is really intended to be a vehicle for independent providers to come together under a contractual relationship. This is a model that is more pervasive in some states than others. For example, I'm in California, and it's a fairly prevalent model in California. And in this particular model, you're also tax exempt. Less common, but we do see them, are nonprofits and other types of legal structures like limited liability partnership and S corporations. A lot of times we get this question a lot, which is that, we've got this nonprofit that's basically sitting on a shelf. Can we take it out and just utilize it and repurpose it for this new network we want to build? And the short answer is usually yes, but sometimes you have to be careful about how you sort of resuscitate that organization, and the fact that you need to be very mindful of how revenues are going to be categorized if that particular entity is going to be used for any kind of payer contracting or gain sharing. Not as much flexibility, for example, as a medical or a hospital foundation or an LLC might have. Any questions on this before we move forward? Okay. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why governance is such an integral part of what integrated networks are taking a look at. It really is the governing body that is representative of its members and is ultimately responsible for maintaining accountability. The governing body, like the board and the committees, are going to be the vehicles for establishing accountability and standards for the participants, and there will be, as I mentioned, signed formal agreements that delineate participation and accountability and lay out how any kind of any kind of gain sharing or flow of funds is set to happen. And ultimately, it's also important that there's a shared infrastructure that is supported through good data, staff, and budgets. And a lot of that will depend on the purpose and the focus of your entity. The governance model, and you guys all know this because I think you probably all have boards of directors and committee structures that you work within, but the governance model ultimately will define how decisions are made and related to the operation of the business. You'll want to establish, I'm getting a notice saying that People's Community Clinic seems to have lost audio. Can anybody else hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. This is Trinity County.
Yeah, I can hear you.
We can hear you fine in North Country.
Okay, hold on. Peter, do you think it's appropriate for me to ask them to try to call back in? All right, well, let's see. I just sent them a message. Hopefully they can get connected here in a second. And Peter, I don't know if you can communicate with them offline. Hi, people. Is that you people? Did we get you back?
We're back.
Oh, great. Perfect. ultimately, it's going to be the governing body that really identifies what's going to be overseen and managed through the governance structure and what is going to be outsourced or staffed internally to the network. And so those are at the beginning stages of a new network. There's always questions about, well, what's the focus is going to be, and how are we going to structure this, and is that going to be an in-house or an out-house function? And those are ultimately decisions that are made and codified through the governance process. Some decisions that will be made on behalf of the new entity will require everybody's the full members' participation, and others will be made just at the board and committee level. So again, probably very similar to how you're functioning now, but I think it's important to understand sort of the hierarchy of how decisions are made and supported through that process. As you're thinking about your new entity, you'll want to be really taking a thoughtful look at who participates in governance. And you'll hear us say this over and over again. From our perspective, we always like to see the safety net providers really in the driver's seat in terms of the governance model. If any of you folks have been asked to join somebody else's network and have not had an active role in governance and been able to effectively participate in that way, you'll know how challenging it can be to not really be able to have the kind of influence and input into that process. As you're considering who participates in your governance model, however, you're going to want to be thinking about what type of an entity it is. Is this a horizontal or vertical network? Are there particular things that you need to be thinking about as you put your governance model together? For example, in some models like the Medicare Shared Savings Program and some of the Medicaid ACO models, beneficiary or patients are required to sit on your boards or participate in governance. And so you'll need to be thinking about all of those things as you're putting the model together. It's also important if there are staff involved in your network, and sometimes there aren't in the beginning, but sometimes there are. And so what is that sort of respective role between and relationship like between the board and the staff of the network? And then how do we think over time, if we're going to be bringing new providers, new organizations into our network, what does that mean for them in terms of their opportunity to really engage in governance? Now, we've seen a lot of things from this perspective as well, where we have, some groups have decided that they are going to, only allow new participants to come in and, for example, engage at the committee level. Others open up the board for elected seats. There's lots of variation there, but you really want to think about how do you protect the sort of influence and focus of the initial founding members and balance that with some of the needs and requirements of new folks that are going to be coming in. So you'll want to be thinking about that over the iterative process of your network's development. So any questions on this? Okay, so some of the key functions, and we talked about this a lot, but the governance model is really going to play a pretty important role in terms of the following functions. Definitely in terms of the oversight of payer relationships. If your network is looking at engaging with payers, this will be largely driven and overseen at the board level. The board will really set and monitor policies related to any kind of financial distributions. In many cases, are compelled and required to monitor and evaluate compliance issues. And in the case of clinically integrated networks, really play the primary role in making sure that all of the components of integration are in place and that the participants are adhering to those. They'll also, the board and the respective governance committees will play a pretty critical role in identifying and monitoring participation standards. And really identifying who comes into the new network and who is not allowed in. And those, again, are iterative decisions that might evolve over time, but it ultimately would be the board's decision to set those standards and make sure that folks have the opportunity to weigh in on that. The governance model will prioritize and monitor administrative and operational functions, so it will be at the governance level, where decisions are made about what type of infrastructure is put in place. And in the case of independent practice associations and accountable care organizations, it's imperative and often required that there is clinician participation in the governance model. That has to do with really making sure that for clinically integrated networks that are implementing clinical programs on behalf of a population of patients, that those clinical programs are in line with clinical requirements and best practice and really being driven from clinicians. So here's a common model that we often will see, and again, we talk about the, sort of the stratified approach to where decisions are made. Members of an organization, of a network, for example, are any person or organization who owns a share in the business. This is sort of the highest level of authority within the organization. Often the members are, usually the members are specifically identified in an operating agreement or a set of bylaws. The member voting rights are typically commensurate with the level of investment that they've made in the new entity. And as I mentioned, the operating agreement will determine which issues that the members decide and which decisions are opened up to either the board or the committee and membership level. The members have the right to appoint and remove the board. So typically this is the group that would elect and seat a slate of board members and board officers. And in some cases, depending on how the organization is structured, the members may be eligible for dividends and proceeds for any kind of sale of the organization. So if you will, probably the easiest way to think of this is, the members being sort of akin to the board of a primary care association or another statewide association in your area. The board is a smaller appointed group, usually elected, that's accountable for overseeing the day-to-day business of the network. And typically, these board seats serve limited terms, although we do see situations where there are permanent board members, and that largely has to do with how the new network was formed. And in the first place, there might be folks that, were what we call founding members, for example, that would always have a permanent seat on the board. Anything that's not specifically called out in the operating agreement as a member decision is typically a board decision, and then the board would have discretion about, how to delegate some of the decision-making authority down to the committees. Typically what happens is any executive staff of the network would report directly to the board, and the board should expect that it's going to be meeting regularly and often with very short notice. As we all know, the environment that we're operating in is very, very dynamic, and we're going to talk in a minute about board composition and sort of optimal conditions for board participation. And it's very typical that early on in the beginning stages of our work together, where the board, it's a pretty heavy lift for the folks on the board, and they're participating often and with a lot of, sweat equity in the work that they're undertaking. And the example that we give here is that the board, if you will, you think about it in terms of like an executive committee of like your state association, for example. Now, committees are really an important function of the overall governance model. They're going to oversee, any type of key functions of the organization in a clinically integrated network. Usually you see some level of a clinical committee, often a beneficiary or patient and family committee as well. It's very common that all of these organizations would also have, finance, IT, and even operations or compliance committees. Committees may not have decision-making authority on some issues. But they might as well. The board might choose to delegate that to them. And the important thing about committees is they do not necessarily have to be made up exclusively of board members. So this is really an opportunity for organizations and practices that are participating in the network to really have an opportunity to engage in the governance process. And it's a good way to really open up those opportunities to new entrants into your network. So we like to spend a little bit of time just sort of talking about, from our perspective, when we look at various networks that have formally decided to work together and put together governance models, we really have seen some best practices. And one of the things that we like to sort of point out is that these types of organizations and networks often function very, very differently than how we may be used to functioning in some of our less formal collaboratives or with our statewide membership associations. So it is going to look and feel a little bit different in terms of how quickly and how tightly these boards and committees need to work. It's important, we think, that the board reports back to the members, that the boards need to be small and nimble. This is really critical because, coming from an environment where, let's say, you're used to having, 20 to 30 organizations represented on your board, and thinking about what it means to have boards of somewhere between 5 and 7, sometimes that can feel like a culture shift for groups as they're starting to work together. But it is really important because some of the decisions that you need to make quickly, and it's really challenging if you're trying to navigate through such a large governance model. It's really important that the members of the network have the ability to reserve those key rights and responsibilities. And in this example, what we've used here is that the board can oversee contract negotiation and signing of payer contracts, but only for example, the board members could approve new participants coming into the network. So again, those are the types of things that would be codified in the operating agreement, but we think it's really important that there is that distinction between what the owner members have the rights and responsibilities around and what the board has. The committees are really the opportunity to draw from subject matter expertise, and we think it's really important that those committees be populated with the types of sort of human capital and human resources that are really going to bring the most value to the work of those committees. So it kind of goes without saying, but, for example, the finance committee should be made up of CFOs. They're really going to be the ones that understand and can help navigate much of that, much of the work that needs to happen on behalf of the network. It's important that committees have clearly defined expectations and rights so that committees when we're working with groups, we think it's important to really identify committee charters and committee work plans, and that those are constantly being, reevaluated with regard to what the priorities of the board and the network are, and that certain committees and governance components will be codified in the operating agreement, but not everything. So we may have new committees or new work groups that crop up over time that we need to respond to, either time-sensitive issues or even ongoing issues, but aren't necessarily codified in the agreement. You want to err more on the side of brevity in your formal documentation process, but that doesn't limit us in terms of being able to identify work groups and committees that are really going to help benefit the work. So here's what some of the success factors are for what we see in terms of groups coming together around network governance. it's really important, and you'll hear Andy use this term a lot, and he uses the term citizenship, and this is really important. Really making sure that groups are really all in on this important work that you have to do, that everyone is invested, that they've dedicated staff time, potentially provided financial or capital contributions, and one of the things we don't have up here, but we should, is really this ability to share data with each other as we're building out what our networks are going to be doing. It's really critical, and in some cases, we've seen networks really make a decision around, in order to actively engage in the benefits of the network, you have to have good citizenship. And so they will often require that those types of investments, whether that's time, money, or data, really be explicitly laid out. Again, small, nimble boards are the name of the game. It's very challenging. If you get too many people trying to make a decision, there has to be some sense of sort of a representative governance model that folks are going to be comfortable with. And again, as we've already talked about this, it's like, really making sure that there is a distinction between what are board decisions, what are participant decisions, and what are member decisions, and then making sure that just everybody's clear on what those variations are early on in the process. Now, we get asked often when we're putting together new groups for input on how to set up effective models of governance. And, we like to point out that every member is going to have active participation in governance, but not every member can be on the board. So member votes are customarily determined usually by investment levels, but don't have to be. Board votes are typically equally weighted. That just makes the voting and the approval process much easier. It means you're not doing calculations on this board member has 2 votes, this one has 1.5 votes. Again, committees should have decision-making authority or report to the board depending on what the issue is, and again, making sure that everybody's clear on what their roles are. And representative board seats make sense, but one of the biggest slippery slopes that we see is groups trying to really over-engineer this process. So, we're often going to suggest that you keep this as simple as possible. Typically what we see is maybe, regional representation. So if you have a statewide organization, for example, you might have X amount of seats from one part of the state versus another part of the state. There might be variation in, another dimension is really around size. Sometimes we see variation in terms of number of patients or rural versus urban. But ultimately you want the board nominating process to be as straightforward as possible, but still meet the needs of the organizations that are participating. But we've seen groups spend a lot of time and energy in trying to put together these really complex models of a representative board composition, and it can get really complicated really fast. And ultimately, I'm not sure how much it really benefits anybody to have something that's so meticulously over-engineered, but those are just some of the things that you'll need to consider. We've probably seen, I don't know, Andy's on the line, we've probably seen, 15 or 20 different versions of how folks have established their board composition. So ultimately, you do need to take a look at what the kind of who your constituents are that are participating in the network. But again, always coming back to this idea that smaller is better, nimbler is better, and representative is better. So here's an example. This is an actual organization that we work with. This is a horizontal provider independent practice association. You'll see here pretty much what we've talked about, which is they've got the full IPA membership all the way on the right. These are, I think this is representative of about 22 organizations. They're the ones that elect the board of managers. They provide capital contributions. They make decisions about who can come into the network and who can't, and then ultimately will decide about if the organization were to be dissolved. That would be a decision that would be made by all of the members of the IPA. They then have a board of managers, which in their case is 7 FQHCs, and these board of managers report back to the full membership. Each of those FQHCs has 1 vote each. And then you see there the key decisions of the board of managers. They make decisions on committee recommendations. They select and supervise the IPA CEO. They provide strategic guidance, and they're actually the ones that make decisions about removing members if folks are out of compliance. And then they've got 4 standing committees that are codified in their operating agreement, and you'll pretty much see it aligns with some of the things we were talking about before: finance, clinical quality, standards, and contracting. Any questions on this? So quiet today. I know, it's such an exciting topic. Boards. Here's another one. Here's another model. This is a multi-provider type safety net ACO. So this, again, is a real organization. The board on this one is a little bit bigger. And part of this has to do with how they had evolved over time. As you'll see, they have 15 seats total. All providers have 1 vote each. In this particular case, they have 9 seats. This organization was developed by primary care providers, and so you'll see here how they have advantaged their position on the board by making sure that their seats on the board are more numerous than the other groups that are represented on the board. So 9 primary care seats. Then they have 1 seat each for the non-primary care provider types that are represented in their organization. So 1 hospital rep, 1 behavioral health rep, and 1 post-acute care rep. And then in their model, they have 3 different beneficiary representatives, because in this particular case, they have a Medicare beneficiary, a Medicaid beneficiary, and a beneficiary from a commercial plan beneficiary. And then similar to the one we just saw, 4 different committees: finance, clinical, operations, and data and IT, staffed by different members of the the staffing infrastructure of the organization, but chaired by members of the board. And then it sort of talks to you about what the purpose of each of those committees are. Any questions on that? Oh, sometimes groups will add in an external partner, like their state association or another organization that is important to the overall functioning of the network. Sometimes those members will have full voting rights, and sometimes there'll be ex officio seats that don't vote, but have the opportunity to provide input and oversight into the strategic and operational functions of the organization. So again, we've seen that both ways. You'll notice too also in the last 2 models, this is kind of a no-brainer, but you see that the board of managers in this IPA has 7 members, and in this ACO model they have 15. That's obviously so that we have an odd number of board seats, so we don't have to deal with too many shenanigans around tie-breaking rules. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit now about the role of governance and accountability. And again, a lot of these things will depend on the type of network that you're forming, but really the board being able to monitor, the various requirements and effectiveness of the network, I think is important in the network maintaining its value proposition to its external stakeholders and potentially payers that it's working with. So it's important that the board have a pretty prominent role in setting of standards and monitoring of accountability. Any organization that benefits from contracts signed by the integrated network are known as participants. And the network needs to establish mechanisms for making sure that participants are effective in delivering on the requirements of the contract. Again, that goes to making sure that the network continues to be able to demonstrate its value proposition back to whomever it has signed those contracts with. And so it's important then that the network establishes and updates a set of standards for participation. And again, those are going to be the minimum requirements that the board sets and will monitor member performance against. And so committees may also provide recommendation on standards. That's particularly the case where you have clinical requirements or clinical performance requirements. The board, for example, might delegate to the clinical committee or to a standards committee the drafting up of what those standards should be and then making those recommendations back to the board. Ultimately, the board is going to decide on the strategies for members who failed to meet those strategies or standards, and again, they might include input and engagement from committees in making those decisions. But typically, what does that look like if you're not meeting the standards? It could mean that there are withholds back to low performers. They may not, folks that aren't meeting those requirements may not be able to participate in tiered networks at the optimal level. So, being really focused on just kind of maintaining their ability to meet basic standards before they can move into opportunities within the organization that would afford them more gain sharing options. They could even be excluded from contracts or ultimately removed from the network. And so it's really going to be important that there are clear processes in place for when participants are not meeting standards, that there's some kind of remediation program, that there might be a requirement to redirect resources to them, for example. But ultimately, it is the board's responsibility to oversee and monitor that process. Boards have a lot of flexibility in identifying the types of standards that they think are going to be necessary to manage the business. And again, a lot of this will depend on the type of network that you're forming. We tend to fall back in our examples on clinically integrated networks because we see that there is a lot of consistency in terms of what those goals and aspirations are of those networks. So again, we've called out 3 different types of standards that we see typically, but again, we might want to have, as I mentioned, a 4th set of standards around things like citizenship or participation. But again, clinical standards would really identify, for example, use of common clinical pathways and protocols, clinical outcome expectations, and the like. Financial standards, there might be particular revenue cycle targets that your network wants to make sure that its participants are adhering to, and there could be also operational standards, things like extended hours of care, meaningful use of health information technology, data sharing, things like that. So there would be sort of a minimum set of standards here, and they would be clearly articulated, and the board would be overseeing these in an ongoing way with the help of the committees. Standards and accountability has a pretty big impact on the network's ability to effectively contract. Keep in mind that as the network evolves, it's going to see higher sort of a risk-reward contracting is going to increase over time. So you'll be taking on, as you become more effective, you'll be taking on and evaluating riskier models of contracting. And it's really important that we've got the kind of information that we need to make sure that we're positioned well as a network to take that on. And so it'll be important that we revisit and realign what our standards are to really meet the requirements of those contracting expectations. So the payer might require, for example, that all primary care physicians operate in an NCQA level 3 medical home. So that would have to be a standard that the network was setting out expectations around and then providing resources back to its participating practices. And so, others example include things like utilization management goals around emergency department use, for example. So there could be, again, things that are specific to the payer requirements that would need to show up and need to be supported through the standards. performance measurement, I think we all know, and I think that's a big piece of why we're all here today, is really thinking about how the emerging models of reimbursement intersect with our ability to measure our performance. And we would anticipate that the governance models of these new networks would be taking a hard look at this and would be identifying some thresholds for performance measurement and improvement that would be supportive of what the network was trying to accomplish. And there's typically some areas where we see this, obviously improved clinical quality, improved financial performance, and then anything that really demonstrates the higher value to patient and payers. And so that could be, patient engagement, it could be other efficiency models, anything that, again, largely driven by what the payer and other contractual requirements would be, but we would want to be really identifying a set of baseline performance measurement standards that we could then be monitoring over time. And I would really, and we always do, expect that we're going to see that it's going to start out at a certain level in terms of what our performance baselines look like, but we really would expect that those would be increasing over time. And, that's because we want to see sort of a gradual raising of the bar. We don't want to leave too many people out too quickly, but we want to make sure that over time our network can demonstrate that it's got the sophistication that it needs in order to really engage with external stakeholders and payers. What we typically suggest with new networks is that you really look to where you're already collecting performance measures. And so depending on what sector of the safety net that you're working in, you might already be universally collecting things like HEDIS or MGMA or HRQ, whole different, PCMH, whatever the indicators are that you're currently collecting. That's where you want to start, and then and then over time, expect those to grow and expand. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about formal agreements, and I think then we're going to spend some time talking about the group project. And then I will expect everybody to talk because I've been talking for almost 45 minutes and I'm about ready to lose my mind. The formal agreements that typically that new networks and undertake really outline the responsibilities, requirements, and what we call the meaningful commitment of the members in the network. Formal agreements are going to be where you stipulate things like capital investment, participation requirements, any kind of gain sharing that is being managed through the new network, performance measurement and management, operational administrative processes, and always important is the use of data. We like to break these out because it is important to kind of create some distinction in your minds about the roles of each of these documents. So we're going to start by talking about the operating agreement. Operating agreements are akin to what in the nonprofit world we call bylaws, and operating agreements are just really the sort of for-profit name for that similar document. This is a document that is really focused on how the entity or the corporation conducts its affairs on a day-to-day basis. So this is really where you see the specifics around things like board size and composition, the authority of the board, the types of committees that are codified, and again, not all committees, but maybe 3 to 5 committees that are codified, and who can participate in those committees, any type of legal compliance. Anybody who's ever seen an operating agreement knows that they're usually about 30 pages long, and 15 pages of it is usually legal descriptions and requirements. That's why you've got to have counsel involved in that process. And then operating agreements will also lay out the process for adding and removing members and participations, as well as selling or liquidating the business. So those are different than service contracts. Service contracts are usually used for non-clinical participants in the network. So, these are partner organizations might sign a service contract, or any third party that provides some kind of service back to the network, like vendors. So you, for example, potentially would have like a credentialing or a data vendor. They would have service contracts, and those contracts would be between the formal entity and the vendor. They might have sub-agreements with individual practices, but there would be a formal agreement back between the two main organizations. The service contract is going to define the financial responsibility of the entity to its service providers and service level expectations of the service providers back to the entity. So like what is the vendor or the service provider doing for the network, and what is the network doing to help support that work on behalf of the contract? So typically you're only going to have one operating agreement. You may have multiple service contracts depending on who's providing service back to the organization, to the new network. And then participation agreements, you could have multiple participation agreements depending on the type of organization that you are. But typically this is the document that outlines and describes the participation requirements and standards for network member practices. So oftentimes there will be participation agreements. For example, if you're looking at payer contracts, you would have a participation agreement between the practice and the contract and the integrated network for each of those payer contracts. So again, not everybody may sign all participation agreements, but you could, depending on how many of the activities of the network you were involved in. The participation agreements, as much as possible, particularly if you're in an organization that is implementing more than one of these, as much alignment across those agreements as possible, so you don't have different agreements for every single, or different requirements for every single agreement. Some of the typical stuff that we would see would include things like current licensure requirements, adherence to HIPAA and privacy and other compliance requirements, adherence to anything that's in that payer contract, or maybe it's a programmatic requirement. Maybe you guys are coming together under a grant or program. That participation agreement would need to specifically stipulate that the participating organization is going to meet those requirements. Attest to the willingness of being held accountable for performance. That's really important, and often you'll see that language is required by the organization that you're contracting with. And then there could be any other number of stipulations that are outlined in those agreements, whether it's the sharing of financial gains or insurance requirements or other operational functions that the contract requires. Data is the name of the game, as you guys know, and it is very common, and many of you are probably already in situations where you are involved in data use agreements, and these are agreements that are going to outline the requirements, permissions, and limitations for data sharing and use. Usually these documents are fairly broad so that you don't have to always be coming back and modifying them every time you need a new set of data, but it's always going to, whenever possible, stipulate it's always going to include legal privacy standards like HIPAA. And there might even, depending on what the data exchange involves, may be additional privacy compliance that both parties need to adhere to. These agreements, again, are between the network and the participating practice, so both entities will sign them. And oftentimes, depending on what the data is being used for, it may specifically outline kind of what the process is for transmittal of data and how frequently that needs to be collected and reported. And then finally, payer contracts. These are held in the case of a clinically integrated network, contracting network. They are held by the network, and they define the expectations of the network and its participants relative to that payer. And it could include service expectations of the network. It could include performance expectations of the participating practices, and what will most definitely define payment terms to the network and to the participants. So it'll stipulate which funding flows through the network and which is passed along to the participating practices. So just some best practices before we go into the discussion about the group project. And again, these are based on, our experience of working with a lot of groups that have looked into these, have developed these types of networks. Operator agreements need to be flexible enough to support some unforeseen circumstances. So you don't need to anticipate every possible scenario that could ever happen with your new network. You don't need to contemplate that and codify that in the agreement, but you do want to have enough protection in that agreement that it's hard to modify, so that if you need to make some changes, you have the ability to do that, but that requires, appropriate levels of authority and member support. Participation agreements need to be clear regarding the interplay of standards, quality, and payment. This is particularly true so that folks understand what they're at risk for if they're not meeting those participation requirements, and that we see a lot of changes in participation agreements as programs and contracts evolve. Service contracts should be defined early in the process, and everybody's roles and responsibilities for what's in those service contracts should be clearly articulated. And payer contracts ultimately are going to be the mechanism that delineates payment terms to the network and the members, and so those pieces need to be cleared and mutually agreed upon. Okay, so now I've just talked for almost an hour. And so I want to kind of get a sense from you guys, and you guys know, I will call on you. So I would love to kind of get some input from you guys on, as you've been thinking through formalizing these networks, let's just start with the third bullet. Can you give me some examples or maybe talk with the group about the types of committee structures that you think would best support your network? What types of functions within the governing model do you think are important? I will call on folks, I promise. Hey, Jason Dunn, can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, and maybe help us understand what type of governance model might work best with your project?
Sure. This is Jason Dunn with Jordan Health in Rochester. And we're collaborating with a number of other FQHCs in the area and some community-based organizations to form an IPA. Primary driver, and I believe one of my colleagues, Jim Cummins, is on the line as well. So Jim, correct me if I'm mistaken. Primary driver really is to level the playing field with the managed care organizations, because they, in fact, are going to be the agents for the state in everything Medicaid. So we want to make certain that we have enough weight that when we sit down and negotiate rates, we're able to do so and secure rates that will help us continue to deliver on our mission. We're in the process of putting a shelf corporation together, so we'll have it ready to rock and roll. And I think as we've thought a bit about what we might need internally around governance support, some of the struggles that you've mentioned of who's on the board, how many seats the different constituents have, we haven't quite delved into yet. But I do think there's a sense that first and foremost, the quality of the care being delivered has got to be a key focus. As we look at the new value-based system, that's got to be front and center. Immediately behind that is the quality of the data, because your ability to manage the quality of the care is directly dependent upon the quality of the data you're going to your system. Then I think we would probably rank the contracting piece as a third critical committee. Offshoot of the quality would be, I don't know if we're going to go down the route of a credentialing committee for who might want to join us. But those are some thoughts. We're in the very, very early stages of thinking about it. Jim, did I hear you speak up earlier?
No, I didn't speak up earlier, but I think you have described our situation very well in terms of where we are, and now with the formative stages of the corporation and the bylaws and what have you. So I have nothing to add to what you described.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. And I think that's true. I mean, I think it is this whole piece about clinical performance and effective use of good quality data, particularly in a network like yours, it's really going to be integral to your being able to perform at the level you want to perform at and leverage the kind of relationships you want to have and influence you want to have with payers. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Alicia, how about you guys? Alicia's going to avoid me. That's fine. Let's see.
Hey, this is Kendall with Kearney County.
Sure.
I'll just piggyback a little bit on to what was just talked about. Well, we're not formalizing an agreement. We kind of have an informal, loosely knit ACO, so to speak, that I think down the road will continue to move toward formalization, and which it will covers a wide area of Kansas, a fairly big swath of western and southwest Kansas, I will say. And one thing that we're trying to be as a leader in moving toward value-based versus volume, and showing others in rural care, healthcare out here that it can be successful, and creating a model that, along with proving our outcomes, proving our quality of outcomes, quality of care, and data, and then being able to bring the others along, excuse me, along with the HMOs, and saying this model is successful, and this can be rolled out to these other entities. And I think we're looking at ourselves as a leader in kind of bringing the HMOs along with the other rural health care providers out here in Frontier, Kansas.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it is also a way. I think it's interesting because when you think about really engaging other providers in your governance model, it really is a way to kind of educate them about the approach that you are taking. It allows you really to help them understand better kind of what your models of care are and how they fit into that, rather than the inverse. And it sounds like that's an important part of your strategy.
It is. And, when we talk about keeping people out of the hospitals, we're trying to keep people out of the ER and out of the hospital, and moving them toward the clinic, and eventually reducing clinic visits, being unnecessary to have as many clinic visits. And they're, they kind of get a deer in the headlight look on it, because they have such a low census typically in the hospital anyway, that $2,300 a day or something, you're saying give that up, because that that's helping drive us, versus seeing the value in the value-based care and being incentivized for doing the right thing versus how we're being incentivized currently.
I think that's really important. Let's see. Let me maybe put this question out to the broader group. I'm hoping folks will jump in. When you think about who is in your network now, even if it's not totally formalized, who are the potential new members that you think you might want to be engaging with over time as the work matures? And what do you think some of the challenges might be with that in terms of getting them represented in the overall governance model of the network? Is there anybody who wants to maybe speak to that? If you know who you're working with now, but you can see down the road how things might evolve and who you might need to reach out to, and what do you think some of the challenges might need to be addressed in order to accommodate that? So, for example, when we provided the model of the multi-provider type ACO, that organization started out as a primary care-led effort, and over time identified that they were going to have to expand into hospital, post-acute, and behavioral health. So it really required them to be thinking about how their governance model would need to support that, how their participation requirements might need to be modified. So, for example, there might have been primary care performance measures and operational measures that they were very familiar with, but they had to really think about, when including those new provider types, how that was going to change the type of participation requirements, the type of data they collected, and how they found ways to effectively engage those provider types in their governance models. Do other folks have folks been thinking about that at all, and do anybody have examples of where they think there might be some challenges in creating that kind of alignment? Okay, well, I mean, I think it's just important. I think, for us to just be thinking about how our network is going to evolve over time. And I think we talked a little bit about this. I think it was Jason, or I can't remember who talked about this in terms of initial participation requirements, but just be thinking about how those types of requirements might, need to change depending on who your new network participants might be. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the collaborative project, and as I mentioned, this is really going to be an exciting opportunity, I think, for all of us to hear from each other about how your thinking has evolved over the length of the Virtual Learning Collaborative. And we're excited to have be able to kind of structure some conversation and to hear firsthand from you guys about, kind of what you thought your project was going to be, any things that might have changed as a result of your environment changing around you, or thinking that may have been sparked as a result of participating in the session. So the goal of the project is to really take the learnings from this collaborative into the planning and implementation plans that you folks are implementing back with your practices. And what we want to do is create some structure so that you can go back to your teams at your respective organizations and identify some key action steps and planning goals so that you can take that next step to achieve that strategic priority, whatever it might be. And ultimately, this is a learning collaborative, so the more we can share and learn from each other, the better. And so the goal of that last session when we're all together is really to do all three of these things. So here are the directions for the activity. We're going to, and I think you received some information on this, but I'll open it up if it's not here now. You're going to be working with members of your Virtual Learning Collaborative group. So the folks back at your, whoever you applied to be part of this Learning Collaborative with, we want you to take a look at and complete the Network Development Action Plan. And I'll pull that up in a second so we can walk through that together. Based on the information in your action plan, much like we did with the beginning session, we want you guys just to put together a very brief 5-page slide deck that you're going to present on during the last VLC session on the 30th of August. And what we want to see in that slide deck are the following. The vision and purpose for your new network, including any kind of shared services. And again, you may or may not have a formal network in mind, and that's fine, but at least identify what the vision and purpose of that network is. The participation and governance model that you think makes the most sense based on what you're trying to achieve and who your partners are, what your biggest challenges are, and what some of the next steps are. And we're asking that you guys get that action plan and the slide deck returned back to me by the 24th of August. So you have a little over a month to think this through and put something together and get it back to us. And we just ask for it in advance so we can review it and get ready to sort of tee up any questions and make some general observations and get it all loaded into the system. So I think, whoops. So AJ, I might need a little help here. I want to make sure that were you able to upload the other document, or do I need to just open it from my desktop?
They're both there. The PowerPoint and this document are both there that people can download if they choose.
Okay, I just was trying to get it. up. AJ, do you know if I can get it up on the screen, or is it only the...
Right now I don't. Yeah, I think the two documents are right there in the upload file, like Peter was saying, but I'm not sure if I'm able to pull it up either.
All right. Is there a way for me, Peter, to do screen sharing so I could pull up the document? Because I really want to be able to walk through that document for folks. Peter or AJ?
I'm not. I would have to. I think Peter should be able to let you know. I'll message him real fast and I'll let you know.
Okay, yeah. So if you guys could, in the meantime, if you can download it, I'm referencing the document that says LC1 Session 3 Network Development Action Plan. And this is basically the working document that we provided to you guys to help you think through some of the planning elements that you would want to consider with the development of your new networks, regardless of how formal they might be. And what you see here are, and this will correlate back to the presentation that you'll be doing in that last session. So the first section of this focuses on the vision and purpose of the network. And, we ask a number of key questions there. What is the goal of the network? What health reform or market conditions is it helping your group to respond to? What are the benefits back to your potential partners? And, really, is there widespread agreement about what you're trying to accomplish? And if not, how might you work to support that? So then the next column is where you would sort of be jotting down your thoughts and reflections with your group members about how you would respond to all those questions. And if there are some specific next steps in order to accomplish those things, whom from your group would be responsible for that, and is there sort of a timeline for trying to accomplish that? The second piece is around network shared services and activities, and this is really the place for you to identify what the shared services, functions, or activities would be that would be included in the network's purview. Again, is there widespread agreement about these? Oftentimes, there is a general idea, but the specifics may not have been fully fleshed out and agreed upon. So how would we want to make sure that we had done a good job in prioritizing and clarifying what the purpose is? And then finally, are there other folks or other organizations that should be involved to really expand or establish these services? So, for example, do we need a vendor contract to help us with any of this? Do we need to be looking at a partnership with another external organization, or is there another service provider or clinical provider that we want to make sure we get at the table? And so then you would just want to be thinking through those things together as well. And then similarly, kind of if you have some key next steps or follow-up items, who's responsible for that and what are the dates on that? The third section has to do with the things that we've talked about today around network structure, governance, and participation. So really having the group spend some time talking about which of the network models might fit best. Are we talking about a formal ACO, IPA, or MSO model? Is it less formal than that? Who are going to be the key partners and participants in that network? And then including an organizational model diagram that shows what your model of governance and participation might be. And you can always refer back to kind of the org models that, oh, here we go. I'm opening up the screen sharing function, so please bear with me, folks. It's going to take a minute for that to download. So I'm going to keep talking. So, including basically an org model that would describe what that governance and participation would look like. So what are your committees, who sits on your board, that kind of thing. The next area, the fourth area, has to do with addressing current capacity and gaps. So this really gets to the point that Jason raised earlier. What kind of data is your network going to need as it's establishing itself? How are you going to get access to it? How are you going to gather it? What are the various components of any kind of capacity assessment that your network would need to identify in order to either establish baseline information, identify, prioritize services and infrastructure. So a lot of times you see groups, and we've worked a lot with groups on things like clinical capacity surveys or payer contract assessments, revenue cycle management, those types of things. So if you think you need to do any kind of capacity assessment to get a sense of where you are in terms of some of those baselines, whether that's from a performance perspective or just understanding what your infrastructure is, what might those capacity assessments be, and how would you look to gather that information? And then finally, what are your next steps in achieving the goals of either creating or joining some kind of a new network? So what are your short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals? And how do you see those being identified and prioritized relative to the groups of the groups that are participating in your network? So this, as I was mentioning, the Network Development Action Plan is really intended to be a working document for you to sit down and then identify, what are some of the key organizational and infrastructure development pieces that you want to accomplish, and then how can you use that action plan to really, think through what your organization is working on and how it wants to evolve over time. So what we encourage is sit down, do the action plan, and then from the action plan put together your 5-slide slide deck, and then identify somebody from your group who can present out in the last session the slide deck and kind of be prepared to respond to questions and things like that. We don't want to create too much heartburn in terms of the project, but we do want to be able to link some of the key concepts that we've talked about over the course of the Learning Collaborative back to the work that you intend to do with your group. So I'm having all kinds of problems with my Adobe Connect, so I can't actually see what you guys can see anymore. But I guess I want to stop there, and I'm sorry for the technical challenges of not being able to walk through this together and look at it with each other, with all of us looking at the same thing on the screen at the same time. But are there any questions that you have about the project, any concerns, any clarifications that we can provide? Is everybody kind of clear on what they need to accomplish with that?
Yeah, I think you're pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's all I have for today. Are there any general questions or comments from the group or from any of the ASU folks or Starling folks that are on the line?
This is AJ.
Hi,
I just wanted to... Oh, go ahead.
AJ, I was going to ask you if it would be possible to have the second session slide deck sent out. I was not able to download it and haven't seen it since.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll get that. I'll be working on that. I'll send that out.
Great, thank you.
The other thing I wanted to just let you guys know, I did send out the invites for the rest of the VLC sessions. I'm sure most of you should have received those, but if you haven't, please just send me an email and I'll get that sent out.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks so much. And next time we meet, you'll hear from Andy. He'll be talking about infrastructure components of networks, and so it fits in really nicely with the discussion we had today around governance. So we look forward to ongoing discussion with you guys over the next couple weeks. And please feel free to, as you sit down with that document and you start thinking through what you want to have in the, what you want to be thinking about in terms of your network. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to clarify, respond, help you think through things if necessary. I mean, we really want to be a resource for you guys as you're thinking through this stuff. So if you think that's appropriate, just feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.